All right, let's go ahead and jump right into where we left off, by the way, going ahead and throwing it out there. Super proud of the work y'all did. Very, very impressed with the way your romanticism posters are coming along. Love the fact that you're a day ahead of everybody else. Love the fact that you're going to have 2 extra concepts on your test that nobody else is going to have because y'all are an honors class and you're absolutely killing it right now. Very, very proud. So impressed that I'm going to try to keep this flip 25 minutes or under, all right? So let me go ahead and get my timer out, and now it's rolling, all right? So we now just finished up everything going on in Latin America, right? And we also talked about everything that went on in Europe following the era of Napoleon, right? 1815, Congress of Vienna, Clemens von Metternich, conservative kryptonite, constitution, self-determination, rah, rah, rah. I highly suggest you go back and you start studying that stuff, right? Just definitely go ahead and start studying your industrial rev stuff. Remember, your study guide is due the day that you take the test, all right? Just a heads up. Make sure you know that. It's going to be worth the quiz grade, all right? So big things going forward, though, and getting straight into this. You need to understand that we're now jumping back over into Europe. First of all, when we talked about Romanticism, right? We went over to Latin America. We talked about Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, Gran Colombia, blah, blah, blah. But now what we're going to discuss is chaos and nation building in Europe. And now remember, I told you this needs to be adjusted, okay? It should actually go 1815 to about 1900/1914, give or take, all right? So, because we had to take a second to talk about the failure that is the age of Metternich, right? So Europe, we've been going for a little while. How you been? Well, the big thing about it is it depends on who you ask. By the way, if you write, so Europe, how you been, in your notes, come on, all right? So, depends on who you ask, right? Europe has been cataclysmically changed, as demonstrated by Romanticism, the themes it reflects, right? The Enlightenment didn't fix anything, etc., 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 okay? So industrialism is heavily sweeping the continent, yeah? So whenever we first started with the Industrial Revolution, we began to talk about how agrarian lifestyles, agricultural revolution, enclosure system, then the inventions of the Industrious Revolution come along, flying shuttle, spinning jenny, water frame, blah, da, 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 steam engine is going to take factories from looking like this when they were settled out in the countryside to looking like this, right? Where you're going to be creating things inside of an urban environment, and urbanization is going to be massively big. This right here, for example, is a iron smelting factory, right? This is pig iron that they're pulling off of this forming device, and they're actually processing, forming, and smelting iron inside of this facility and in this factory, right? So you went from having a life that was based around agrarianism to a life now based around the factory model where you have different working class citizens, and you have a middle class now and an upper class conservative growth, and now we're also ending up with cities that look like this, right? We moved from agrarianism to industrialism. We moved from famine to surplus. We also, though, moved from subsistence to pollution and overexhaustion, right? So things are getting crazy. And in the 1815 to 1848 years, that's known as the Age of Metternich, right? The Age of Metternich may not have had war on the international scale, right? Austria wasn't fighting France, and Austria wasn't fighting like Prussia, and Russia didn't come after the Ottomans during this time period, but they did go after smaller groups, and they had a lot of internal conflicts, right? You have to understand that everybody's fighting on political orders now, right? The conservatives are going to Spain and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies and suppressing constitutionally elected governments, right? They want social order and absolutism back. The classical liberals wanted more government participation, i.e. voting rights, sorta. They want some voting rights, but not everybody to be able to vote. They want economic independence, laissez-faire economics, capitalist systems, whereas conservatives want absolutism and mercantilism. And then on the flip side, the socialists, or the working class, they want bread, mostly. Like they want proper treatment, nourished bodies. They want to be fed. They want food. They want bread. They want fair treatment by the government. They want full government participation. They want to be able to vote. And they also want bread, all right? So, there's a big thing you need to understand about the dynamics of the isms right now. The conservatives are advocating for the upper class. The classical liberals are advocating for the growing power of the middle class. The socialists are advocating for the workers, right? And a lot of this is because while Latin America was liberating itself, Europe was still in turmoil, but not on an international scale, okay? So you have to understand, France wasn't going and fighting anybody, but they had a lot of crazy stuff going on within their own kingdoms, right? For example, France went through 3 different kings in 30 years, right? Actually, technically, it's 4 different kings in 30 years, but we'll get to that 4th guy here in a second. You have to understand that Louis XIV, he ruled for literally 70 years, right? 70 years. And in 30 years, you went through 3 kings. Technically 4, if you count the one that was there for 20 minutes. Now, you have to understand, like, it started off with Louis XVIII coming back, right? He was known as the desired one. After the Congress of Vienna, Louis XVIII would be reinstalled. That's the brother of Louis XVI. Some of you are like, Mr. Terry, what happened to Louis XVII? Why did he get skipped over? Well, the big reason why is because that was the son of Louis XVI. He died inside the French Revolution. He was never technically coronated, so we always usually call the desired dead one Louis XVIII, right? And Louis XVIII is going to rule up until about 1825, when then his cousin, or his younger brother, Charles X, is going to take over, who is an absolute and emasculated weenie, if you ask me, because he's so worried about his manly projections and blah, 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 blah. And, like, so he goes and invades Algeria and North Africa for no apparent reason, which causes a small revolution. Right? And we're going to talk about that small revolution here in about 2 seconds. It's known as the 3 Glorious Days, right? And this guy is going to end up abdicating the throne and gets ran out of town by a revolution in France again, but it only lasted 3 days, right? It's also known as the July Revolution, or the Revolution of 1830. Yeah, that's right, Courtney Stahl. You heard me. Eugene Delacroix, Lady Liberty Leading the People, is a romantic piece about the revolution that was made to drive Charles X out of town. And then you had which is this guy named Louis, Duke of Orleans, right? Louis Philippe, Duke of Orleans. And he's not an effective leader. He's not very strong. He's just a new family. And so the Orleanian dynasty takes over, right? Fun fact, though, there was a Louis XIX. So it went Louis XVIII, Charles X, and then Louis XIX, but he was literally only king for 20 minutes. Like, after Charles X left, after the 3 Glorious Days, because people started throwing furniture and stuff out the windows, Louis XIX, his son, took over. He was like, I will be king. 20 minutes go by, and he's like, just kidding. And then he ran off too. And then so what was going to be elected is this guy named Louis, Duke of Orleans, Louis Philippe. Now, the liberal ideas of constitutional government are spreading, okay? And they're mostly spreading in secret, right? And you can see the spreading of liberal ideas in these 4 kings, right? This guy was the one that was a constitutional monarch first. When he came to power and the Bourbons were restored, he had a constitution that governed all of his rights, right? Charles X, when he came to power, was bucking back against that constitutional system, wanted to go out there and invade a province in Algeria. That made the French people mad. They had a small baby revolution that lasted 3 days, and they went against him, right? And he abdicates the throne. And then this guy shows up, Louis Philippe, and he actually embodies some middle-class liberal ideology, right? So liberal ideas are spreading, and the middle-class sentiment is growing. And it's all also spreading in other countries, too. It's spreading in Italy, Austria, Prussia. So middle-class people are starting to get really, really feisty. And little small revolts are breaking out everywhere. It's mostly made up of lower-end middle class and also peasants as well. For example, the Battle of Peterloo is a big one. The Decembrists, the 3 Glorious Days. All of these were revolts or examples of revolts. Now, you don't have to write down the nitty-gritty of all these things, but you do need to know that there was massive action going against a lot of these domestic governments, right? For example, the Battle of Peterloo, that was actually made to mock the Battle of Waterloo, was an event when over 1,000 people showed up in Manchester, England, to protest the idea that suffrage didn't exist for all people. And they were also protesting these things called the Corn Laws, right? And the Corn Laws were like massively benefiting the aristocracy, and the aristocracy was ending up getting a lot of money based on the hunger of middle-class citizens and socialists, right? And so the conservatives then unleashed the cavalry on this giant protest, which kills upwards of 20-something, several dozen people. And the first person killed in this entire event when the conservative cavalry rolls through and starts sabering these people to death was a 2-month-old child that was knocked out of his mother's arms, right? So in the Decembrist revolt, a bunch of Russians in this one actually showed up, Russian military middle-class members, showed up to protest the coronation of a very conservative Russian king by the name of Constantine, right? And they like show up and they're like, we refuse to fight. And at the Decemberist rally, the Russians would be shot by the conservative upper class troops that were being commanded by them. And then going forward also the Three Glorious Days, which is the one where I just talked about where the little like turd boy, the weenie boy, like the Charles X, gets ousted in 3 days, right? The Three Glorious Days was a revolution that happened in France in 3 days, right? So basically what ended up happening, it all started when the military starts getting moved around because Charles X is about to suppress this new constitution and do all this other stuff, and people start throwing chairs and dishes and plates and stuff out onto the streets and on top of the military. And basically what ends up occurring is in 3 days, Charles thinks there's no way to retake France, so he runs away and he leaves. And then Louis, the Duke of Orleans, takes his place. So as you can see, revolutionary sentiment is still very much there. The middle class is very mad right now because they're like, we got our Constitution, don't take it away from me, right? So I want more suffrage. I don't want suffrage for everybody, but I want more suffrage, right? I want more of these things. I want more rights, and I want the absolutist leader to never exist again, right? So you got that inside the cities, right? It's very important to understand that revolts are breaking out inside the countries, inside the cities during this age of peace for the Metternich, right? But then also in the countryside, you've got famine, this era known as the Hungry 40s, right? So in the 1840s, you've got revolts happening in cities, you got famine in the country. So you've got mad middle-class members and socialists in the cities, and then you got agrarians that are still left out there, that the Industrial Revolution has left behind, that are still farming everyone's food, that are starving to death. And food prices are skyrocketing due to these bad harvests. Now, there was a very, very large system, meteorological, there you go, phenomena that affected a lot of the famine, or affected a lot of the crops that were actually growing in the 1840s within Europe, right? And when I say meteorological, I mean weather, but I also mean a problem with disease, right? So the biggest one to use for the Hungry 40s is known as the Irish potato blight, right? So all of a sudden in Europe, from 1845 to 1849, out of nowhere, there was this thing known as the Great Famine, also known as the Irish potato famine, right? Which broke out because the Irish potato blight, which is a disease that infects the innards of the potato itself and causes it to spoil from the inside out, began to massively destroy all of the potato crops that were growing, mostly in Ireland, but also in other areas of Europe as well. And now the reasons why this blight was so severe and why it caused famine all over the place is because you have to understand that the potato was being adopted as a way to mass produce farmed goods, right? You got to understand that potatoes grow very efficiently, right? So after discovering potatoes in Peru, the Europeans are going to decide to take the potato and mass produce it. They're going to use it as the crop of the poor, right? They're going to take this potato, and they're like, I don't know if you know this, Irish people and also poor people throughout Austria and Germany and other places like that, that if you take 1 square inch of this potato and stick it into the dirt, that potato will make 2 pounds of more potatoes. That means that if you have a 1 pound potato that has 4 eyes on it, right? Not even a 1 pound, let's say a half a pound potato. It's got 4 eyes on it, these little like slits inside the potato, and you cut those 4 eyes out and stick them in the dirt. You just took 1 potato that's a half a pound and you turned it into 8 pounds of potatoes, right? So that's huge, and it's going to stimulate population growth, right? More people are going to be born because they're eating more calories because potatoes are chock full of calories. I love potatoes, all right? So now, but also you got one issue though. They're all growing the same kind of potato. They're all growing the common brown potato. So if all of you are growing one type of potato, that means that it's just a matter of time until a virus comes through that kills every single one of those potatoes, right? So the Great Famine occurs because of this monoculture issue, right? Monoculture disease is whenever you actually end up with a disease that kills the crop that you're growing because you're growing too much of it, right? This is a monoculture, right? Growing only corn. And so if a corn disease shows up, it's going to kill all that corn and we're going to starve to death. Whereas biodiversity systems make it so, okay, if a disease shows up and kills our watermelons, we still got all this other stuff to eat, right? And the problem is some of you are like, well, Mr. Terry, why didn't this affect the Inca? Because the Inca actually grew over 120 different kinds of potatoes, right? So if a disease came through and affected one of them, they were like, oh, well, we got 119 more where that came from, right? So it's not a big deal. The results of this, though, is going to be a massive amount of immigration, a massive amount of death from starvation, a massive amount of stillbirths as well. The Irish population lost apparently close to actually 1 million people in population decline from stillbirths, right? If you actually go look up a graph, and I can actually tell you that this graph will be on your test, you can actually see that the Irish population is still yet to recover completely from the Irish potato famine. And some of y'all can trace your history, your family history, back to the Irish potato famine because your family may have immigrated to the United States during this time period known as the Great Famine, right? Because they were driven off of their land and the British were refusing to give them aid, right? But if the Irish that are growing the potatoes and those potatoes are used to feed Great Britain, what's going to happen in Great Britain cities as well? People are going to be going hungry there. And also, if your supply of your food is down, that means that the demand is up. That means that the prices are going to rise. So because of things like the Great Famine, because of the Irish potato famine, prices on food are going to skyrocket, right? And these terrible situations led to this crazy monumentous moment, the culmination of all these terrible sentiments occurring in Europe between 1850 and 1848 to these things known as the revolutions of 1848, right? So what ends up occurring was in 1848, there was this thing known as the Springtime of the Peoples, right? So it was a series of dramatic and violent revolutions that broke out all over Europe demanding reform. The middle class wanted more voting rights. The socialists wanted more voting rights. The middle class wanted free capitalist societies with no absolutist and legislative bodies. The socialists wanted bread and stuff, right? So they wanted workers' rights and also more government reforms and things like that. So what ended up occurring is the middle class and the socialists, this is key, jot this down, the middle class and the socialists united together to hold revolutions all over Europe in the same year. And I'm not kidding, upwards of 20 different revolutions broke out all over the continent. Revolutions broke out in Prussia, in Austria, in Italy, in France, not in Great Britain or in Spain, but we won't get into them right now. Italy, all over northern Italy, all over the other German principalities, in Hungary and other places like that. Crazy intense revolutions, and they demanded more government participation, less power of the monarchy, guaranteed rights and protection under the law, right? They wanted to rip down the old aristocracy order and reinstall a newer one, a better one, a more positive one. And how did they function in this thing? Well, they learned something from the French, right? The French Revolution was very chaotic. It's kind of unorganized, super extreme. Sans-Culottes members burning down, well, they weren't Sans-Culottes members yet, burning down the Bastille and destroying a lot of other things. Well, the revolutions of 1848 were a little bit different. They started building these things known as barricades, right? So you got to understand, in that 3 days, that 3 glorious days revolution, where the French king was successfully ousted by a bunch of middle class and socialist rebels, they were actually going to be ousted because of barricades, right? The French people realized that since the streets of European cities are so narrow, right, you can easily build barricades up to block the roads, right? And by blocking the roads, you can stop military movement all over the city to suppress this revolution. And you can create protective boundaries. This, for example, is the barricade that was built in Berlin, right? And this is the other crazy part, is the military is being depleted because a lot of the military members are middle-class members who are actually fighting in this revolution against the aristocracy. So then, this one right here, this is a photograph from 1848 in Paris. You can actually visibly see the actual cobblestones that have been ripped up in a barricade that was built in Paris, right? The barricades are very, very important. And I'm telling you right now, this is also a French barricade, right? This is actually outside of Saint-Antoine, and this is literally, if there were Olympics for building barricades, the French would win every time, all right? So the French can build barricades like no other. It's ridiculous. The German one is good, don't get me wrong. The German one's solid. But the French build barricades like it's going out of style. Look at this right here. You got 1, 2, 3 of them that have been thrown up all along the same route to prevent the military from moving through and to force the conservatives to make concessions. And these revolutions were so efficient that they had massive early success, right? Huge early success. And what's going to end up occurring is France's king, again, is going to abdicate, right? Duke of Orleans, Louis Philippe, is going to abdicate, and a guy's going to be elected president? That's right. France, because of the revolutions of 1848, is going to actually elect a president. They're going to draft a new constitution that is going to allow more suffrage, more people are going to be allowed to vote, and guess who they appoint as president first? This guy, Napoleon III. Some of you are like, what happened to Napoleon II? Well, he's dead already, all right? Napoleon II died at the age of 21 from tuberculosis. He died in Austria. That's the son of Napoleon. Napoleon III, on the other hand, is Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. It is Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, right? And so he is going to be elected as the president? You're telling me right now that France got rid of a king. France got rid of a king. No more kings in France ever again, right? So because of the revolutions of 1848, new constitutions are going to be granted not only in France, but in not Germany yet, but in Prussia, Austria, even in areas of Italy, right? And nation states are going to be able to be formed. People are going to identify with their countrymen rather than their king. They're going to be like, we German people united in Prussia to get our demands. And we also want to unite the rest of the Germans together. Now, the Prussian king's going to refuse to do this, but we're not going to get into Frederick Wilhelm IV right now. But the big thing about it, though, is early on, as you can see, these revolutions got stuff done, right? They got a lot of stuff done, had a lot of early success because the liberals and the socialists united together to get their demands met. But unfortunately, once the demands begin to get met, then there becomes some infighting, right? The liberals and the socialists then began to turn on each other, right? The two groups that came together to fight these revolutions then began to turn on each other. Now, the revolutionaries might have done this early on, but the best example to give you this, because I know right now Julia Flowers, like Marissa, I know right now, for example, like Rachel Merriman, I know you are all like, man, I really need an example to understand what you're talking about, Mr. Terry. You're telling me they came together for a few months to get a lot of early success, but then they hated each other after that? They actually did, right? The revolutionaries began to fight each other, right? And suffrage is the best example, okay? Because the middle class people were like, yes, suffrage is fantastic. Let us extend suffrage to smart people with a little bit of money. And then the socialists are like, whoa, everyone should be allowed to vote. So these disagreements would lead to infighting. Conservatives are going to seize upon this opportunity and overthrow some of these new constitutions and roll back the reforms. The only thing that these revolutions truly changed, like life-alteringly changed, is serfdom would be pretty much outlawed in all of Europe, right? Now, the biggest thing about it, though, is granted these revolutions failed in their ultimate goal of creating democratic nation states and things like that in Europe. However, they are a massive turning point, okay? The only ism that truly spread and stayed true was this new idea of nationalism, right? And the revolutions led to a renewed interest, a new idea of united peoples under one banner, leading to nationalism movements like the ones in Italy, Germany, and Hungary, right? So the Hungarian national movements are only going to result really in 1867. They're going to create a dual monarchy. Italy's going to become a country, though, which is going to be really, really intense, right? So now some of you are like, but Mr. Tay, what about all this other stuff? But the biggest thing you need to know is that the revolutions of 1848 may not have been successful on paper, but they were successful in creating the spread of middle-class ideas and giving the socialists a chance to organize, and also forcing the conservatives to grant some concessions, like constitutions, basic rights, you know what I mean? Things like that. And also, after the revolutions of 1848, many countries would begin to adopt certain things like parliaments, right? For example, the short-lived Frankfurt Parliament in Prussia is a really big one, right? So nationalism, though, is the virus of an empire. Now, we talked about this earlier, right? Nationalism and self-determination, because remember, conservatives love their empires. They want to keep them. Nationalism is now nationalism, oh, there it goes. Nationalism has now spread to the liberals and the socialists, and it's uniting all of them. Italy is a really great example. Now, you don't need to know that much about Italy. Just say Italy united, okay? But write this down. In 1861, Italy became a country. And it's mainly because this guy, Victor Emmanuel, and that guy, Count Cavour, and then that guy in the south, Garibaldi, took this and turned it into that, right? So you need to know the best example, though, of the unification of any country under one nationalist banner following the revolutions of 1848 is under these guys. Yeah, that's right. The unification of Deutschland, right? We're getting into Germany next. I will see you guys in class. Y'all have a great one.